Welcome. And you've got a very interesting ETF, a kind of food ETF. So do you want to just tell us what the ETF is? Its usual stuff like tickers and its kind of mission in life, and then we'll talk a little bit about how it's been doing as a ETF, and I suppose actually as a sector and a theme because it is thematic over the last sort of 6 to 12 months. But what is the ETF first?
So it's obviously designed to be a sustainable food transition fund, right? So it's not looking to just invest in the broad food sector or the food innovation sector. It's specifically looking at this transition to a sustainable food system, right? It's designed as an Article 9 fund. There are a lot of other, sort of food products out there which are just food products, food innovation. It's very different, right? There's a lot of stuff in there that really is not taking us towards this, the sustainable food system. So that's the kind of premise of the product.
So I understand. So it's really not. It's not a classic food tech ETF. No. It's more a sustainable food tech ETF.
Exactly right, and it's not just even tech. It's like what are all the sort of enabling subsectors that are going to facilitate that transition to a sustainable food system. So a lot of work. Took us 10 months to develop the taxonomy for that. But very proud of it. It's won, I think, its third award now, a couple of months ago. So it's we're really pleased with it. It's a very, very interesting product. Obviously had some challenges this year in terms of performance, which we can talk about. Tom can cover that. But I mean, lots of interest from our clients, and we think it's obviously very well positioned for the future and that transition.
And when you say sustainable, what do you mean by that? Because you'll be as aware as everybody else about the big debates around sustainability, greenwashing, ESG, and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
How do you make the grade, so to speak, in terms of sustainability?
Well, the first thing is you've got to do your research, and if you look at a lot of these other products out there, the research hasn't been done. Yeah. And the first thing is, where are all the emissions? Where's all the deforestation, the environmental issues? Where are they coming from, right? The food system has kind of gone by the wayside in this whole conversation around carbon emissions, and other greenhouse gas emissions. And we had the global methane pledge that the U.S. government led on as part of COP26 a few weeks ago. And the funny thing was, they were talking about capping and limiting the methane coming from the oil and gas industry, which is less than 30% of total methane emissions. The majority of it comes from the food and agri sector, and the majority of it comes from animal agriculture. So, there's I think the conversation around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also more acute environmental issues like deforestation, tropical deforestation in particular, they cannot be addressed without addressing the food system. The fact is, the removal of trees in places like Brazilian Amazon and other places, it's a direct thing that's being caused by humans. It's not an indirect impact like climate change. It's a direct thing. We're going in there, we're chainsawing down the trees, and then we're putting in place cattle pasture or soybean plantations to feed us and feed the animals. So the first thing is you've got to figure out what is the source of all the emissions and all the environmental degradation coming from. The food sector is mammoth when it comes to dealing with this. There's always been a lot of sort of industry pressure and things like that to keep the food system out of the spotlight with respect to this. But actually, we think it's going to be a big part of COP27 next year. So governments, industries have been subsidizing the animal agriculture industry, the dairy industry, commercial fishing for years, right? So to change that is quite a big change in really turning the ship around. But we cannot have a sustainable food system, and we cannot address some of these major environmental issues without talking about the food system and the transition to a sustainable food system in the same way that we're talking about the transition in energy.
So you mentioned that you built your taxonomy. So does that taxonomy mean that you would not let in a conventional food company that was trying different things? So I don't know, classic example would be, Danone has got a very successful milk alternative in Alpro, but it's also got conventional food businesses, for instance. Yeah. I'm not picking on Danone, it's just a name that came to mind.
Yeah.
So there's quite a few of these big food companies have got both. Yeah. Both, more sustainable products and arguably possibly less sustainable products. How do you build that taxonomy?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the way that we did it, and a lot of this is also, you've got to sort of cater for your investors, right? You've got to create something that's understandable and simple, rather than being overly complicated. So what we did was we picked out all the sort of enabling subsectors, to hone in on your example there. The plant-based food sector is one of them. But you cannot have a situation where you're investing in Tyson Foods, which is a meat company. They might have a small division, which is peanuts of their overall revenue coming from this plant-based chicken nuggets that they might be developing, because it's not touching the sides in terms of revenue for them. And they are a meat company, and they are the second largest in the world, and they are a major issue, right? Same like JBS, another massive meat company. Dannon, it's effectively dairy. It's a huge issue. Again, it's very difficult for us to say to our investors that we're creating plant-based food sector, we're enabling the transition, when we're holding a company that is a dairy company. Yes, they might be investing in that, but it's also difficult to sort of, to try and set a threshold at which point it's kind of acceptable and not. The fact is, those companies that are principally, meat companies, dairy companies, commercial fishing companies, we just outright leave them out of the fund, because it's too difficult to try and create something that's not completely subjective in terms of how you select these companies or not.
Another one, because these details matter, but something like John Deere, for instance, big in ag tech, Now, again, one can make an interesting argument both sides of the fence there, because John Deere is enabling lots of technology, big in ag tech, but let's be honest, what goes in tractors, red diesel, So again, would something like that, and they're actually quite big in ag tech, and actually, if you're going to get a more sustainable future and use less water, for instance, using GPS-enabled tractors with technology is one way of getting there, So
exactly.
They're in a kind of another category where it's not, as you say, with some of the big food companies, what they do in sustainability is a small bit of what they do. But there are businesses like John Deere and I suppose the Novozymes of the world, who do ingredients, where it's actually quite a big bit of what they do, but they've equally got a big bit of which they, arguably, in a sustainability maybe shouldn't do. So again, how do you deal with those kind of more hybrid companies where there's quite a big bit of ag tech or food tech in there, interested in sustainability, but there's also not?
Yeah, so the way we do it, and we can talk about John Deere because they're a fascinating case study, but the way we do it is we principally, we look at each company, and we obviously have our 8 subsectors there, so plant-based foods, ingredients, or precision farming. And we look at each company and go, how much revenue are they deriving from the theme, right? Because if it's insignificant, then they're not going to benefit from the growth and the tailwinds of that theme like a company that's very, very exposed. So we score them out of 5. A company's got to have a minimum 20%. But then the higher the proportion of revenue they derive from one or more of those 8 sub-themes, the higher the weight they get in the index as well, right? So a company that is 100% exposed to plant-based foods or precision farming or whatever, they're going to get a higher weight than a company that's only scoring a 2. That's kind of how we deal with that. Now, as I mentioned before, we do have some outright exclusions, right? So meat companies, dairy, commercial fishing, because they are completely incompatible with this transition to a sustainable food system. And even if they had 20% exposure, which is our minimum, which would generally get them in, we actually keep them out. So that's it. Yeah, in essence, how we do it. John Deere, they're a fascinating company. So they're in our precision farming segment of our index. Now, what they've done, they're trying to figure out how to sort of remarket themselves as like a tech company rather than just a mechanical tractor company. Tractors haven't really changed in 100 years. I mean, they're the same things pretty much. You look at them, they're not that much different. It might be a bit bigger and a bit greener and yellower in the case of John Deere. Yeah, and more expensive. But fundamentally, they're still mechanical sort of machines, right? And what they've done is John Deere bought Blue River Technologies in 2017, robotics company. They have this see and spray technology, which they use to assess each plant in the row of the field and give it exactly what it like, plant by plant care, basically, is what they call it. it massively reduces, and this is the idea, is it massively reduces the inputs that are needed in the farming process. So yes, whilst the tractor itself might be using fuel, whatever, to power itself, the broader benefits that precision farming will bring to the farming process obviously could hugely outweigh, what's being used for the fuel. And you'd expect, obviously, these tractors to become electric over time and things like that. But in the meantime, they're reducing the amount of water that's used. They're reducing the amount of nitrous oxide and things like that are coming off of some of the fertilizers and all these kind of things that are being used. All of this is then also impacting the broader environment, right? You don't have so much runoff going into the environment. So it's water, it's resources, but also you've got labor shortages, things like that in farming, which are being addressed by sort of greater automation and machinery. So they're a fascinating company. They actually did another acquisition this summer. They bought a company called Bear Flag Robotics. So they're really leading the charge in this space. They're a fascinating company, and it's great having them in there.
Okay, that answers my question. They're in the index.
Yeah.
Tom, run me through what are the kind of the big holdings in the index? We're sitting here just before Christmas 2021. You can go to the fact sheet and look for yourself, I suppose. But what are the kind of key holdings at the moment in the index or on the ETF?
Sorry there. I think if you look at it in terms of sectors, you've got sort of consumer staples accounting for about a quarter of the fund, and also heavy weighting towards materials. And sort of thinking about performance, recently you've seen some weakness there. Consumer staples, you've kind of had this sort of analyst expectations being slightly too high, and firms haven't been delivering. And I think that's been something that's affected the sort of broader market. With materials, you've had supply chain issues, which again has kind of affected everything, and that's kind of explains some of the weakness that you've seen recently in the third quarter. So really, it was off to a good start. Since launch, it's performed well. We've just seen a bit of weakness recently with that performance. So,
so again, what are the big names that are in the index? I mean, presumably people like Beyond Beef is in there. Beyond Meat, sorry. Beyond Meat is in there.
Yeah. Beyond Meat, Oatly. Oh.
Sorry, go on, Tom.
Yeah, I was going to say Oatly, Beyond Meat, App Harvest, Dole. Some of these large names, and obviously there's some companies that are sort of less popular. But yeah. Yeah,
Stuart, you were saying.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going on off mute. There's quite a few there, and they're sort of representative of some of the bigger sub themes that we capture, right? So we've obviously got bulk core there, which is aluminum. That's in our sustainable packaging subsector. We expect obviously that to do well over the coming years as more and more countries ban plastic packaging, especially single-use plastic packaging. France is the latest one to do that, with effect from the beginning of 2022. Obviously, John Deere, we've talked about, that was one of our top 10 holdings as well. Another packaging company, Oi Glass, they're in there, Tattooed Chef. It's a real mix. FMC, there's agri-science company. There's I think a nice mix at the moment, but some precision farming in there, and sustainable packaging are some of the larger holdings at the moment. Also in plant-based foods with Dole.
And I suppose the question I suppose is it more large cap based, or is it more mid cap based? So let's talk through what we've just talked about. Really, John Deere is a mega large cap, pretty big by American standards. Beyond Beef would probably be actually, especially after its share price decline. Beyond Meat, sorry, after its share price decline, is probably now big cap. So where's that kind of mid cap, small cap bias in the fund at the moment?
Sure, I'll start off, and then Tom can jump in if he fancies it. So it's actually pretty evenly split at the moment between small, mid, and large cap. So I think we've got about 30% in small and large cap, and about 39% in the mid cap. So it's fairly evenly split at the moment between the three of them.
And I'm just looking down the top fund holdings. Here we are, December. It will probably, if somebody watches this later, it will change in the new year. But just run me through some of the names that people may not have heard of. We've already mentioned the likes of Deere and Co. That's called Deere and Co, not John Deere. So we all call them John Deere. But FMC, so many people, and Balchem, so they're two of currently the bigger holdings. What do they do? Just run us through what they are.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just quickly cover off FMC, and then maybe Tom can cover Balchem. So FMC, they're an agri-science company, so they're involved in all kinds of different things. Crop protection is a big part of that. So I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realize with with what's happening in the agri science space is the fact that a lot of crops around the world are really suffering, right? So we're taking plants that have evolved or they've been bred with specific traits over hundreds of years, and in some cases longer than thousands of years, to sort of grow in specific climates and everything else. We're now trying to grow these same crops all across the world, right? So we're growing them South America, Africa, Europe, whatever. And they need to be resistant to an increasing sort of number of, because what's happened with globalization has not just happened with tech and fashion and food trends and stuff like that. It's happening with disease and fungal disease and pests and all these kind of things. So you have an issue in one place, it tends to spread, but also you've got localized problems with farming, right? So what that requires is localized solutions to different things. Sometimes these can be broader, but for example, we're running out of citrus around the world, right? There's a disease called Huanglong bin or citrus greening, which is wiping out slowly, working its way around the world, wiping out all of the citrus. The only way we're going to solve that is with agri-science, right? So developing genetically edited seeds and cultivars of the relevant fruit. And we've got the same issue with bananas, and this is like a big thing that a lot of people don't realize, and we obviously know that a lot of people have an issue with GMO, genetic modification of food, which is obviously the genetics of the particular crop. But genetic editing is quite different to that. And so what we do, and the reason why FMC is in, but some other companies aren't in, is because FMC is not involved in the genetic modification. So
I was going to ask. That's why you've not got the likes of Syngenta and Monsanto.
Exactly.
Those guys. You don't want GMO stuff in.
No. So and that's also like there's this big hangover from sort of the 90s about GMO and how bad it is and everything else. But there was a lot of hysteria around that, and some people would even throw the genetic editing into the same bucket. But they're quite different. Genetic modification is when you're introducing sort of DNA from other organisms into one. For example, you could take the green skin from a frog and put it into a human, right? But people don't like that because you're sort of interfering with nature. Whereas genetic editing is where you're taking the genome of an existing organism and you're just taking out the stuff that might make that that tangelo susceptible to powdery mildew or whatever it is. It's wiping it out, or Huanglong bin, citrus greening. So there is a big difference between the two of them. So for us, we include companies that are involved in genetic editing, but we exclude companies at the moment that are involved in genetic modification. Now, this whole as more regulation comes to pass and everything else, we may change that, but at the moment that's how we've done it. So yeah, that does mean we lose companies, but companies like Monsanto would probably come out for other reasons too, because we also have they've obviously been involved in a significant number of controversies over the years. So we also have this kind of exclusion list that we apply to our fund outside of the sort of pure classification, where we lose things like meat and dairy and stuff like that. So this broader exclusion list, we will then snip out companies that are involved in stuff that, controversies, things that we don't like and stuff.
Okay. And Balchem, tell us a bit more about Balchem.
Tom, do you want to cover that?
Yeah, I can do, sure. It's an interesting one. They have kind of four main segments, if you like. Human nutrition, so they deliver customized food and beverage ingredient systems. They also provide animal nutrition and health. So they provide various sort of products relating to animal health. They have specialty products. So they provide chemicals for use in the healthcare sector. and also industrial products too. So they manufacture and supply certain sort of derivative products for those markets.
Okay, and while we're just round off the top three, there's also a company here called Calavo, and I must admit, I've heard of the other two, but actually even I've not heard of Calavo. what is Calavo? Growers would seem to give the game away. Calavo Growers.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Stu.
Sorry. Yeah, so they're avocado growing company. So very much in our, they're plant-based foods effectively. So, but they really started out, I think, as an avocado company. So, it's what's good about the way we sort of build these themes is that, we work with, a thematic research partner to help us find these companies, right? And put them, effectively store them and allocate them to a specific subsector of the theme. And obviously work with thematic research on this. And Calavo is one of the companies that they obviously uncovered as part of that sort of ongoing research that they do. So yeah.
So the performance. So just run through what performance has been in hard numbers. So when was it launched, and what's been the returns on the ETF in whatever defined period?
Tom, I'll let you cover that one.
Last year, I mean, I don't have the actual figures right in front of me, but I think on a year-to-date basis, it's roughly sort of up 2.5%, something like that. Okay. And if we look back since launch, which, as I said, sort of March, yeah, it's about sort of 9%, just behind the index by about 100 basis points, which is kind of what you'd expect for that time period.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And so do you think that investors would look at this as, and I think I know what the answer is, as part of more their kind of responsible, sustainable bucket of investments, or do you think they'll look at this as more of a kind of disruptive technology part of their solution? So people probably have got like digital infrastructure in there, and then they might have a side pocket of more kind of disrupting food. Where do you think this fits in the portfolio test? Because they do actually, people look at them in different ways, don't they? Because they do look at more sustainable ESG investing and think, I want a pocket for ESG and sustainability, and I'll put stuff in there. So that means it's more up against kind of your traditional ESG ETFs, or do you think it would sit in most people's disruptive pockets?
That's interesting, because obviously you've got, within the ESG bucket now, I think what we're starting to find with our clients is that they're actually breaking that down further into, ESG and then enabling, so sustainable objectives, whatever, which are very different, right? So ESG fund is obviously you're okay, you might be FTSE 100 and you snip out the weapons, you snip out the pornography and the tobacco and all that. But there's no specific objective to transition to a more sustainable economy. Whereas a sustainable fund, an Article 9 fund, is you're investing specifically in enabling sectors, right? And that's what the food fund is all about. We've got another one, our environmental impact fund, which is doing similar, but it's effectively identifying some kind of enabling subsector or sectors and investing in those. So they're quite different. And I think this fund fits very much in that second bracket. Now, you might stick it in an ESG bracket, ESG portfolio too. It's quite a broad-based exposure. If you look at some of the sort of classic sectors that are represented by it, but other people might say they put it in their thematic bucket. They might put it in a bit more of a techie bucket. But I wouldn't. I think actually it transcends a few of these different places, and depending on the client and how they've structured their offerings to their investors and things like that, it can land in a couple of different places. But yeah, we definitely think that within that ESG bucket, it's becoming much more sophisticated, particularly in Europe, and in certain regions. And it's they're very much looking at this. Some clients are telling us they're not going to invest in anything other than Article 8 or 9. They're only going to be Article 8 or 9 from sort of end of 2022 onwards. Which is really interesting. Not everyone's saying that to us yet, but yeah, it's quite interesting. But there's very much a difference between the two of those, and we're Article 9 with this fund as opposed to just Article 8.
And just explain for those who don't understand the difference between Article 8 and Article 9.
Yeah, so Article 8 is your ESG fund, right? So it's your S&P 500 minus weaponry, pornography, tobacco, your classic sort of ESG exclusions, and you might have some kind of climate alignment within that or something. But there's no specific objective of investing in the transition. Whereas an Article 9 fund is specifically investing in the transition, like you're investing in particular subsectors like clean energy or the sustainable food transition or other areas of environmental impact or social impact that are just have a sustainable objective.
And I suppose, just to finish off, in kind of that's very bureaucratic language because it's set by the way people are thinking about these things. But I suppose there's a difference between ESG funds and impact funds. I suppose we increasingly hear a lot more about people wanting to create an impact, a sustainable impact, versus a more kind of data crunching ESG exclusion. And that's the real difference between the two types. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's that impact piece that is difficult to quantify, right? So you can, the way we sort of look at it is in two different guises. You've got one is forward-looking impact, like you anticipate based on research of, say, like we were talking at the beginning, the issues with the animal agriculture and the emissions coming from that. By cutting that out, you have an impact, a big impact. But it's, on a forward-looking basis, it's very hard to say that particular company saved this much water, kept that much water use out of the broader economy, or saved that many trees from being cut down, because it's so indirect. So that's the challenge with this whole impact thing. So if you were to publish sort of impact metrics on your portfolio, they're going to be quite different to the forward-looking sort of thematic impact that you're talking about with respect to the theme. So that's one of the challenges that sort of exists with these Article 9 funds, for sure. And until there's better data available, and that's going to be many years away, you won't be able to kind of do it. It will be sort of very deep research on enabling subsectors and the impact that they have had, as opposed to what individual companies have had. Anything coming from individual companies on that is going to be completely subjective, I would say.
Absolutely, totally agree. Okay, Stuart, John, Rize, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.